Hey, what's going on, everybody? So, I'm gonna go back to talking about what I call the Blonde Ghost Network, which was a network of CIA operatives, um, pretty much from the Vietnam War era up until you can arguably say Iran Contra, but notably up until the early '80s, which involved CIA operatives such as Edwin P. Wilson, Frank Terpil, Theodore Shackley, whose nickname was the Blonde Ghost, in which I give this cadre or cell of CIA officers their namesake, and others, right? So, in the last video about the Blonde Ghost Network, as I call it, I kind of just went through all the connections about how they touch upon, the Nugan Hand Australian bank scandal, how they touch upon the secret war in Laos in the Golden Triangle, how they deal with, Air America, Iran Contra, you know, um, a lot of the clandestine operations in Africa, and even a lot of the Operation Condor right wing fascist dictators that the CIA was helping to prop up in Latin America. And also how the Blonde Ghost Network even ties to a lot of other, you know, clandestine CIA deep state mythology or lore, such as which are actually based on reality, by the way, such as the P2 Propaganda Do Masonic Lodge in Italy, which was associated with right wing terrorists such as Stefano del Chiai, and the list goes on. I mean, we can even talk about the rat lines of World War II with the Nazis and how you had people like Otto Skorzeny with paramilitary groups, etc., etc. But I kind of just talked about a lot of those connections in the last video, but because there's so much here, I kind of want to like focus, right? So there's a really good article that was, I wouldn't necessarily say the impetus for me doing, taking these notes, but it was an article that I found based on my fascination of this network after watching the documentary Frank Terpil, Confessions of a Dangerous Man. It's a pretty good documentary. It's about an hour and a half, and it talks about Frank Terpil and how he's basically on the run from U.S. authorities because he, along with Edwin P. Wilson, helped sell C4 explosives and other sort of armaments to Gaddafi in Libya. But Frank Terpil was later discovered to essentially be an arms dealer and terrorist trainer for the CIA, or at least this kind of illegal cadre of blonde ghost operatives who were kind of acting like cowboys without the real oversight of upper management, allegedly. But Frank Terpil had ties to people like Mehmet Aka, and the Grey Wolves, and the Grey Wolves are a Turkish fascist organization. And then Mehmet Aka, who was a member of that, shot Pope John Paul II. And it just goes, just so many crazy connections, right? Of just Cold War lore, And there's a lot of good documentaries out there. I might list those off later. But let's just stay on track, right? Blonde Ghost Network. Let's read an article before I go into the bios of all these people. And it's a good article, and it's called, hopefully it doesn't put me past the paywall. Okay, so let me see here. It's going to be a long article. All right, let me blow it up for you. Too big. All right, so I think that's probably good. So it's called Selling Out: How an Ex-CIA Agent Made Millions Working for Gaddafi. I'm gonna pause it, take a quick water break real quick. Okay. All right, so it's called Selling Out: How an Ex-CIA Agent Made Millions Working for Gaddafi. And this is by the New York Times Magazine. And this was published on April 13th, 1986 by Peter Maas, or Moss. All right, so let's read, right? So, like most people, I first read about Edwin P. Wilson in the newspapers in 1981. He was said to be a former operative for the Central Intelligence Agency, who had placed himself in the service of the Libyan dictator and godfather of international terrorism, Colonel Muammar el-Gaddafi. These accounts, Wilson was portrayed as a mysterious figure, sort of a great Gatsby of the espionage world. What especially caught my eye was that he owned a huge estate called Mount Airy Farms in the fashionable Northern Virginia hunt country, an estate, I will learn, that abutted those neighbors like the tycoon Paul Mellon, Virginia Senator John Warner and his then wife Elizabeth Taylor, and Jack Kent Cooke, the multimillionaire owner of the Washington Redskins. Wilson had acquired the estate while still in the United States intelligence service, and I wondered how this could be. I knew that CIA pay grades were the same as those of the other federal agencies and departments. Then I discovered that most of Wilson that most then I discovered that the most Wilson had ever gotten in salary from the CIA was $25,000 a year, and that his salary in his later employment as an ultra secret Navy spy operation known as Task Force 157 never rose higher than $32,000 annually. Just as a decade before, I began work on quote unquote Serpico, the story of the brave officer who had exposed pervasive corruption in the New York City Police Department. Even in those bad days, a cop who suddenly brought a house on a couple of acres in the suburbs with a pool, say, or a tennis court would have at least attracted some raised eyebrows. At least some questions would have been asked. All told, Wilson's net worth was more than $15 million, including approximately $1 million in numbered Swiss bank accounts and South African gold. Yet nobody in the dark, sensitive, security conscious circles in which Wilson moved seemed to care about any of this had been made possible. The CIA remained silent about Wilson, where he had come from, what his role in the agency had been. But as his name continued to be embarrassingly coupled with the CIA in headline after headline, other stories attributed to unnamed intelligence sources started appearing in the news media and then in a book by a Washington author, Joseph C. Golden, that dismissed Wilson as a fringe player whose low-level agency contract was subject to renewal every couple of years. According to these accounts, Wilson had been recognized early on as a rotten apple and had been promptly tossed out. So when I began researching quote unquote manhunt about the eventual pursuit and capture of Wilson, who by then had become an international fugitive, it was crucial to know that his true role in the CIA had been how he had operated in its ranks, and to determine what circumstances within the agency itself had apparently allowed him to slip so easily and so profitably into his terrorist activities. So, did he have Confederates? Was he in operation? Although my previous investigative work had led me into areas of organized crime, as well as law enforcement and political corruption, my sole connection with the spy agency had been when I was a reporter and the CIA tried to recruit me in the hopes of using my journalistic credentials for its own purposes. Still, I had developed trusted sources over the years, and through them I met others who enabled me to gain access to classified documents that detailed Wilson's intelligence career. These included career summaries and evaluations from the CIA and the Office of Naval Intelligence, as well as reports by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the Defense Investigative Service, and the CIA's Office of the Inspector General. So through these documents and through dozens of interviews with people who had worked or dealt with Wilson, I discovered that he had in fact been a highly valued agent who had not been fired at all, but rather had left the CIA because he wanted to, Even more astonishing, I learned that for a long period of time, both the CIA and the FBI had a very good idea of what Wilson was up to in Libya and had done essentially nothing to stop him. Far from hindering his activities, in fact, the traditions and procedures of the intelligence community were in many ways Wilson's greatest asset, even after the true nature of his dealings was disclosed. Although the personal characteristics that were to shape Wilson's career were evident even before he joined the CIA, the agency afforded him the opportunity to act upon those traits, especially when he got into covert paramilitary operations. There he learned the fine art of falsification, of creating dummy business entities, and moving funds through the international banking system so they couldn't be traced. Wilson became adept at manipulating the agency's internal practices for his own benefit, its reverence for achieving results regardless of the means required, and its compartmented structure, which forbids intelligence officers to inquire into each other's activities. And when he started getting bad press notices, he skillfully exploited the us versus them syndrome that so characterizes the agency in the face of outside criticism. In the same way the police band together in a conspiracy of silence during the Serpico revelations, despite clear evidence of massive corruption. To this extent, Wilson's story invites alarming questions about the ongoing potential for abuses within the CIA and other American intelligence organizations. The ease with which Wilson was able to misuse his intelligence training and connections for private gain, and his success in winning the cooperation and complicity of other officials who were eager to cash in on their influence, raised the likelihood that this case was no aberration. The inability or unwillingness of the CIA and other intelligence agencies to police themselves threatens to ensure that Wilson's dangerous brand of espionage and entrepreneurship will pose a continuing threat to the integrity of the intelligence community and to American lives and interests abroad. So Edwin Wilson was born into a dirt poor family in Idaho in 1928. In high school, he was a member of Future Farmers of America. Still a teenager, he shipped out as a sailor in the Merchant Marine in the Pacific. He worked his way through the University of Portland, a Catholic school ran by the Holy Cross Order. It was, he told me, the first time he had seen men wearing dresses. As a Marine Corps lieutenant, he arrived in Korea after the fighting was over, but tore up his knee so badly, leading a patrol along the demilitarized zone, that he was informed that he would be discharged with a 10% disability. Hitching a ride on a Navy plane to Washington in an effort to save his commission, Wilson began telling a civilian passenger next to him about his past. The man said that if things didn't work out with the Marines, Wilson ought to give some thought to the CIA. The agency might be in the market for someone like him, the man said, without identifying himself, and gave Wilson a contact number and name to call. So Wilson filled out a personal history statement, underwent a battery of medical and psychological tests, scoring well as the kind of adaptive, self-reliant, action-oriented personality the CIA especially prizes, and waited while a lengthy security check determined that he was a person of good character, of the highest integrity, opposed to communist ideals, and loyal to the United States. Finally, he passed an exhaustive polygraph examination designed to ferret out what intimate secrets might still remain hidden, and formally joined the CIA on October 27, 1955. So in early 1956, he stood with other CIA officers at a remote Air Force base in Nevada desert north of Las Vegas, listening as the legendary director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, told the officers that they were embarking on a mission that would revolutionize the gathering of intelligence and forever change its nature. Behind Dulles, as he spoke, so ungainly on the ground with its long drooping wings, was what the Russians would come to call Black Lady of Espionage, the high altitude U-2 spy plane, whose existence was then the agency's most closely held secret. Wilson had been assigned to the CIA's Office of Security as a member of a special 60-man detachment that would guard the U-2 planes and keep tabs on the pilots, the support crews, and their families. Since he would be going overseas, he was given a fake identity as an international representative for the Maritime Survey Associates with a mail drop address at 80 Boylston Street, Boston, Massachusetts. All right, I'm going to take a quick break. Okay, so four U-2s were based near Adana on the southern coast of Turkey, and Wilson went with them. Among the pilots he watched over was Francis Gary Powers, whom the Russians would manage to shoot down in May 1960. So in January 1959, newly married Wilson was transferred to the CIA's Washington field office. For a time, he guarded a KGB defector who exposed one of the most important Russian spies the United States ever nabbed, Colonel Rudolph Abel. There was a nice irony to this. Abel would eventually be traded back to the Soviet Union for the captured U-2 pilot Gary Powers. The CIA at the time was engaged in widespread illegal domestic mail intercepts and wiretaps. And one day, while tapping the phone of a foreign affairs specialist for Newsweek magazine, Wilson found himself recording a call with Vice President Richard M. Nixon. It was a heady experience for Wilson. "You'll never guess who I was listening to today," he said to his wife. Wow. Although Wilson was later reported to have played a role in the Bay of Pigs invasion, he was actually an undercover graduate student at Cornell University and its School of Industrial and Labor Relations when the ill-fated landing took place. He knew that for a man of his ambitions, the Office of Security was a dead end. What he coveted and got was entry into the clandestine services, especially the International Organizations Division, which ran labor operations, penetrated student groups, and infiltrated the media under the famous CIA figure Cord Meyer. So his status in the agency also changed. Agents working under deep cover were placed on contract. This gave the CIA an opportunity for plausible denial if questions were raised about whether the operative was an employee, and it gave the agency a way to meet budgetary staff limits, which didn't apply to contract personnel. So many of these contracts were for a specific time or task, but Wilson's was a permanent career contract, subjecting him only to the same performance scrutiny that every staff officer received and providing him with the same medical and pension benefits. Barring across the board budget cutbacks, he was in the CIA as long as he wished. Very interesting. Actually, 1 minute, I'm going to pause. Alright, so let me repeat this paragraph. Many of these contracts were for a specific time or task, but Wilson's was a permanent career contract, subjecting him only to the same performance scrutiny that every staff officer received and providing him with the same medical and pension benefits. Barring across the board budget cutbacks, he was in the CIA as long as he wished. With his merchant marine background and newly acquired academic credentials, Wilson got a job as the European representative of the Seafarers International Union of North America, and with his wife and 2 young sons, settled in a small village in the Netherlands just outside Antwerp, one of the continent's busiest ports. For his other life in the CIA, he monitored cargoes being shipped out of Antwerp for Castro's Cuba. He set up a network of informants to identify key communists on the Antwerp docks, and on a sophomoric level, that gave him great glee, he would make life miserable for visiting Soviet bloc labor delegations by seeing to it that the toilets in their hotels were plugged and that pests like ants and roaches were let loose in them. 6 feet 5 and raw boned, with enormous hands, hands that could easily break your neck. He also took on hazardous side assignments, packing a pistol, for instance, on trips to Marseilles for agency payoffs to Corsican mobsters to keep communist dock workers in line. Interesting. So more of the Corsican connection. So for the first, from the first, money preoccupied him. Although he was being paid by both the union and the agency, he wrote a bitter letter of protest to the union president, Paul Hall, about the cancellation of an agreement that allowed him to take $25 per week out of expenses as a salary supplement. Wilson needed it, he said, because of foreign taxes. So after a year abroad, the CIA brought him to Washington and found him a job in the International Department of the AFL-CIO, which functioned for organized labor in America as a kind of miniature Department of State. As he dispatched to Latin America to help fight left-wing union organizing drives, then he went to the Far East. In 1963, he was in Saigon when the president of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, was overthrown and assassinated. Side note, this is me talking. Uh, that was interesting because I want to say, if I look at my notes here, I think I had that in my. Let me just pull it up here. It's right here. So if we go down, here we go. So CIA Director William Colby, notable for the Phoenix program, which was the assassination targeting campaign, and the Hamlet program, which was the concentration camps in Vietnam to weed out the Viet Cong. Um, William Colby likely knew CIA operative Lucien Conien, who also had Corsican mob ties because from his service in the European theater in World War II. And Lucien Conien knew John K. Singlaub, who was involved in the Iran Contra scandal, but also involved in managing the secret war in Laos, and also helping to train the Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan. And he was also a veteran of World War II as a Jedburgh, one of the U.S. special forces who parachuted into, I think, like occupied France to basically do like sabotage campaigns and stuff like that. But anyways, so Kanye had Corsican mob ties, and he would lead the precursor to the DEA, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. He was also the liaison to Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. during the overthrow of President Dean, 3 weeks before JFK got shot. George Cabot, interestingly, the ancestor of Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., was a merchant with China, also known for dealing in opium. Cabot and the Lodge families, interestingly, are related to the Kennedys, who are a part of the community called the Boston Brahmins, with Brahmins in, I think, ancient Indian type of mythology, or kind of like the highest caste of people or whatnot. So like the blue bloods of the East Coast establishment. So that's just very interesting when we go to this article and they're talking about President Dean being overthrown. I just wanted to give some more of that background information over there. Because Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. is largely known for helping to accelerate, America's entry into the Vietnam War. And of course, you had like the Gulf of Tonkin incident later, I believe, which really got us involved. So let me go back to reading this. All right, so let me read that sentence again. So in 1963, he was in Saigon when the president of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh, was overthrown and assassinated. An important Vietnamese labor leader and supporter of Dinh, who the CIA thought might be turned into a collaborator to serve its interests, wound up in jail. The agency wished to hide its hand, even from embassy officials. So Wilson, as the AFL-CIO's representative on the spot, was ordered to get the man out. He went right to the top, demanding and receiving an audience with Ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge, and promptly obtained the man's release. Interesting. So then, in the summer of 1964, the CIA sent Wilson down a path that dramatically altered his life professionally and personally. He was assigned to special operations, which combined some of the activities of his old division with covert paramilitary operations around the globe. The groundwork for his new role was painstakingly laid. With the blessings of the agency, the AFL-CIO recommended him as an advanced man in Herbert H. Humphrey's candidacy for vice president. Not sure as an advanced man. Actually, let me look an advanced man. I'm not really sure what they mean by that. Let's see here. Okay, so the term advanced man actually means a person who arrives at a location before an important figure arrives. So basically, he kind of gets there to check out the place. So the AFL-CIO recommended him as an advanced man in Herbert Humphrey's candidacy for vice president. So after the election, Wilson told a key Humphrey campaign official, a Washington lawyer named Martin McNamara, that he wanted to start up his own freight forwarding business, and McNamara agreed to do the legal paperwork. Interesting. So, if anyone looked into the history of Wilson's firm, it would appear quite overboard. It actually was a CIA proprietary, one of the front companies the agency financed to disguise its black arts. Special operations had a logistics branch for land, sea, and air support, and Wilson would be in charge of the maritime end of things. Wow, interesting. So McNamara wouldn't see Wilson again for some time, and when he did, he spotted him in a Washington restaurant lunching with a superstar lobbyist and public relations man, Robert Keith Gray. Well, well, McNamara remembered thinking, Ed Wilson's really moving into the big time. Interesting. I'm gonna pause real quick, take some notes. Okay, so let me read this over again. Sorry, I had to take a little break. So after the election, Wilson uh, told a key Humphrey campaign official, a Washington lawyer named Martin McNamara, that he wanted to start up his own freight forwarding business, and McNamara agreed to do the legal paperwork. So if anyone looked into the history of Wilson's firm, it would appear quite overboard. It actually was a CIA proprietary, one of the front companies the agency financed to disguise its black arts. Special operations had a logistics branch for land, sea, and air support, and Wilson would be in charge of the maritime end of things. McNamara wouldn't see Wilson again for some time, and when he did, he spotted him in a Washington restaurant lunching with a superstar lobbyist and public relations man, Robert Keith Gray, saying, well, well, McNamara remembered thinking, Edwin Wilson's really, really moving into the big times. So he has ties to Robert Keith Gray. Writing that down. So Gray had been Gray had been appointment secretary for President Dwight D. Eisenhower. He would go on to form his own firm, Gary and Company, with the unforgettable address, the Powerhouse, Washington, D.C. In the 1980 Reagan campaign, he would play a key advisory role, reporting directly to campaign manager William J. Casey, who was himself to become director of the CIA. So Robert Gray, ties to Eisenhower and Nixon. Oh, sorry, and Reagan, and William Casey via Gray and Company. Gray and Company. All right, so at the time, McNamara saw Wilson with Gray. Wilson was on the verge of forming another CIA proprietary called Consultants International. Later years, when Wilson began cropping up regularly in the headlines, it was discovered that Gray was listed on the firm's board of directors. But Gray told reporters that being on the board was news to him, that he barely knew Wilson. Interesting. So Consultants International is going to pop up again when it comes to a figure named Patry Loomis. So let me see here. So let me write this down. So, gotcha. So, Consultants International with Gray on the boards, on the board of directors, on board of directors. Interesting. So when I interviewed Gray, he insisted that he and Wilson had merely been elevator buddies, referring to the fact that they once had offices in the same building. But this was not quite the case. Um, I obtained classified intelligence documents that showed Wilson and Gray had a close relationship for at least 9 years, during which they had contact professionally about 2 to 3 times a month. Once they had even made a 2 week trip together to Taiwan while Wilson was on an agency mission. Gray also had also sponsored Wilson's membership in the chic town Georgetown Club, where he rubbed shoulders with such other members as Tongson Park, the notorious South Korean wheeler dealer who was at the center of a congressional influence buying scandal in the late 1970s. Interesting. So the Georgetown Club ties to Tong Sung Park. Okay, very interesting. So actually, let me pause real quick. I want to look that name up real quick. All right, so let me read that again. So Gray also had sponsored Wilson's membership in the Chic Town Club, where he rubbed shoulders with such other members such as Tongson Park, the notorious South Korean wheeler dealer who was at the center of a congressional influence buying scandal in the late 1970s. So if I skip over here, blow this up for you. So Tongson Park was a South Korean lobbyist. He was involved in two political money related scandals, Korean Gate in the 1970s and Oil for Food program in the 2000s. Park had a reputation as the Asian Great Gatsby. So Korea Gate was an American political scandal in 1976 involving South Korean political figures seeking influence from 10 Democratic members of Congress. The scandal involved the uncovering of evidence that the Korean Central Intelligence Agency was allegedly funneling bribes and favors through South Korean businessman Tongson Park in an attempt to gain favor and influence in American politics. Reversing presidential candidate Jimmy Carter's pledge to withdraw American military forces from South Korea is thought to have been one of their primary objectives. Interesting. because Jimmy Carter wanting to remove troops from South Korea is another reason why another figure, General John K. Singlaub, was let go because he criticized President Carter's idea. So the United States House of Representatives formed subcommittee on international organizations of the Committee on International Relations to investigate the scandal. During the following hearings, Kim Hong-uk, former director of the KCIA, and various members of the United Church of the United States testified to Park's involvement. Park fled the United States, and South Korean government refused to send him back unless he received immunity. Immunity was refused, and Park remained in South Korea. Following the publication of a report detailing the scandal, 2 members of Congress were charged with the crimes. Representative Richard T. Hanna of California and Otto Passman of Louisiana. Passman was acquitted after a trial. Hanna pled guilty and served 1 year in prison. 3 other congressmen were reprimanded by the House. Parties involved. Tong Sung Park and the U.S. Congressman Richard T. Hanna, D.C., were 2 of the main actors involved in the Koreagate scandal. Tong Sung Park represented the Korean side of the secret agreement, while Richard Hanna was largely responsible for the American side of the deal. According to the agreement, both parties would share the commissions from American rice sales to South Korea and use them to obtain favorable decisions for Seoul in the United States Congress. Hanna was responsible for aiding Chung Il-kwon and Park in finding effective lobbying techniques, which they did by advising the pair to emulate Taiwanese and Israeli models that had succeeded in the past. Park was also responsible for providing extra financial incentives to Hanna and other members of Congress, a task made easy by large rice sale commissions. Such financial incentives reportedly range from $100,000 U.S. currency to $200,000 U.S. dollars at a time per individual. Some 115 members of Congress were supposedly involved. Speculation also focused on the role of the Unification Movement founder Sun Myung Moon, former KCIA director Kim Yong-uk, and former South Korean Prime Minister Chung Il-kwon. So interesting. So the Moonies cult was actually involved in this. And the Moonies cult is very interesting because they own right-wing newspapers in the United States. Interesting. Objectives. The reason behind the scandal involved political, social, and financial motivations. Korean leaders, including Tong Sung Park and President Park, were angered with candidate Jimmy Carter's promise to withdraw soldiers from South Korea and felt it was urgent to build support for preserving the United States military presence. The Park government was also concerned with the approval of a substantial package of assistance for South Korea's military modernization programs. Another reason behind the scandal was to repress or counter increasing criticism of Park's illegitimate policies and human rights violations. According to many, the deceitfulness of Park's objectives would ultimately lead to his downfall. Jeez. So this is very interesting. This is almost something in and of itself we can go more detail of. But what's interesting is that speculation also focused on the role of the Unification Movement founder Sung Myung Moon, right? So this is the guy who's essentially, they call it the Moonies cult, right? Like he thinks he's like a messiah and all that type of stuff, right? What's interesting is he has some weird ties to like white supremacy, even within the United States. as weird as crazy as that sounds. So the author of the Unification Church's religious scripture, the Divine Principle, was an anti-communist and an advocate for Korean reunification, for which he was recognized by both the governments of North and South Korea. Businesses he promoted included News World Communications, an international news media corporation known for its American subsidiary, the Washington Times, not to be confused with the Washington Post. So that's very interesting. So if we click on the Washington Times, is an American conservative daily newspaper. We see here. So the first edition of the Washington Times was published on May 17, 1982. The newspaper was founded by Unification Church leader Sung Myung Moon, and it was owned until 2010 by News World Corporation as an international media conglomerate founded by Moon. It is currently owned by Operation Holdings, which is part of the Unification Church movement. So the Washington Times has published columns contradicting scientific consensus on multiple environmental and health issues. It has drawn controversy by publishing conspiracy theories about U.S. President Barack Obama and supporting neo-Confederate historical revisionism. Very interesting. And then I want to go allegations of racism. So under Pruden's editorship from 1992 to 2008, the Washington Times regularly printed excerpts from racist hard-right publications, including V-Dare and American Renaissance, and from Bill White, leader of the American National Socialist Workers' Party, in its culture brief section. In 2013, Columbia Journalism Review reported that under Pruden's editorship, the Washington Times was a forum for the racialist hard right, including white nationalists, neo-Confederates, and anti-immigrant scaremongers. Between 1998 and 2004, the Times covered every biennial American Renaissance conference hosted by white supremacist New Century Foundation, which has people like Jared Taylor. According to the Columbia Journalism Review, the paper's coverage of these events, which are hotbeds for Holocaust deniers, neo-Nazis, and eugenicists, was stunningly one-sided and favorably depicted the conference and attendees. In 2009, journalist David Newert wrote that it championed quote-unquote various white nationalist causes emanating from the neo-Confederate movement, with which, until a recent house cleaning, two senior editors had long-standing associations. A page in the Washington Times Sunday edition was devoted to the American Civil War, on which the Confederacy was several times described with admiration. So in 1993, Pruden gave an interview with the neo-Confederate magazine Southern Partisan, which has been called arguably the most important neo-Confederate periodical by the Southern Poverty Law Center, where he said, "Every year I make sure that we have a story in the paper about any observance of Robert E. Lee's birthday," Pruden said, "and the fact that it falls around Martin Luther King's birthday," to which a Southern Partisan interviewer interjected, "makes it all the better," with Pruden finishing, "I make sure we have a story, oh yes." The Sam Francis controversy. The Washington Times employed Sam Francis, a white nationalist, as a columnist and editor beginning in 1991 after he was chosen by Pat Buchanan to take over his column. In 1995, Francis resigned or was forced out after Dinesh D'Souza reported on racist comments that Francis made at a conference hosted by American Renaissance the previous year. At the conference, Francis called on whites to quote unquote reassert our identity and our solidarity, and we must do so in explicitly racial terms through the articulation of a racial consciousness as whites, The civilization that we as whites created in Europe and America could not have developed apart from the genetic endowments of the creating people. Wow. So we can so how we went down the rabbit hole, right? Washington Times employees, had a lot of like white nationalists on it, but they were owned by this like anti-communist like religious cult called the Moonies cult in Korea, who were probably in bed with the CIA themselves because of their hardline CIA stance. But the Moonies cult was involved in this Korea Gate scandal of Tong Sung Park, and Tong Sung Park likely knew Edwin Wilson via his time at the Georgetown Club, because of his relationship with Robert Keith Gray, who has ties to the Eisenhower administration, but also was an advisor to Reagan. And this Robert Keith Gray guy helped Edwin P. Wilson set up Consultants International, one of the CIA front companies for Edwin Wilson's promoted position within the Special Operations Division of the CIA, focusing on maritime logistics. Wow. All right, so I'll be right back. All right. So best of all for Wilson. So back to the article on Edwin P. Wilson. So best of all for Wilson, the CIA controller or case officer in his new clandestine job was Thomas G. Clines, who had joined the agency in 1949. Clines was always short on cash and every so often would touch Wilson for a loan, 50 here, 100 there. After all, Wilson had the expense account from his proprietary, and Clines was the one who wrote up his evaluation reports. Clines would go on to become the CIA's director of training. While he was still in the CIA, according to confidential federal investigative records, Clines was negotiating a private $650,000 contract with Nicaraguan tyrant Anastasio Somoza to create a search and destroy apparatus against Somoza's enemies. Unfortunately for Klein, Somoza was forced into exile before he for the deal could be concluded. Interesting. Wow. Okay, so let me write that down. So Edwin, so Wilson's case officer was Tom Clines. Interesting. So let me see here. Okay, Wilson's job was to ship in cargoes wherever the CIA wanted its participation untraceable in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. He sent incendiary crowd dispersion and harassment devices to Chile, Brazil, and Venezuela, arms to the Dominican Republic when a Castro-like takeover was feared, advanced communications gear to Morocco, weapons of all kinds to Angola. So a whole range of high-tech electronic equipment went to Iran. Weapons for a CIA-backed coup in Indonesia, military parts and supplies to Taiwan and the Philippines, logistical support for the so-called secret war the CIA had begun to wage in Laos. He also arranged for boats, flotillas of them if required, such as the ones in continuing raids against Cuba. So in many of the countries receiving agency consignments, he hustled other businesses. The CIA was delighted. Such activities only deepened Wilson's cover. Wilson would nudge up the true cost of these transactions, even those ordered by the CIA. There was minimal auditing and little thought given to what he was doing so long as he delivered the goods. And if the Internal Revenue Service nosed around, the fact that he was running a covert CIA operation took care of that. For Wilson, being in the CIA was like putting on a magic coat that forever made him invisible and invincible. He was ostensibly earning $25,000 from the agency when he began negotiating for the first major acquisition in what would become his Mount Airy farm showplace. But suddenly, the smooth road Wilson was traveling got very rocky. President Nixon, always paranoid about the CIA, had ordered a complete budgetary review, and many of the proprietaries, including Wilson's, had to go. The CIA wanted to retrain him as a case officer and send him to Vietnam, where American involvement was at its critical stage. Uh, but that meant no more fat subsidies, no more freedom to wheel and deal on the side, no prospect of gentleman farming in Virginia. Because we have to remember that Wilson was still working as this kind of permanent contractor status. So he still had to do what the agency told him to do. You know, he still basically has to do all the performance reviews and everything like that. But he's kind of operating in this plausible deniability sort of job for the agency. And a lot of the companies he's setting up, they're profit generating way more probably than what his actual salary from the agency is giving him. But he's getting nervous because if Nixon wants his contract effectively cut, or at least the proprietaries, i.e., the shell companies he's created up, cut or whatever, he's in a bind. He's back to just being, a lowly bureaucrat, but not even necessarily a bureaucrat, a contractor to bureaucrats in a sense. Um, so very interesting. So to the next paragraph. So almost at once, though, Wilson was back in business with Task Force 157, an espionage unit so secret that hardly anyone in the Office of Naval Intelligence knew about it. Among his missions was placing agents in foreign ports to monitor Soviet shipping and launching a series of extremely sophisticated oceanic spying operations. To cloak these activities, the task force decided to make regular use of proprietaries and went to the CIA for advice in setting them up. The task force executive officer at the time recalled the word that came back from the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Ed Wilson is the man you need. Interesting. So if the CIA auditing of expenses was minimal, the Navy's was virtually non-existent in a project totally unprepared to deal with someone like Wilson. In a covert arrangement with the Shah of Iran, he acquired a trawler which was to fly the Iranian flag, cruising the Persian Gulf to scan for nuclear weapons the Soviet Union might be bringing into countries friendly to Moscow, particularly Iraq, and to ascertain the nuclear capability of the Soviet fleet in the Indian Ocean. Interesting. He also handled the shipment of all the sensitive gear that was installed in the trawler. For his part in the venture, Wilson charged and got from the Navy, with particularly no substantiation, $500,000. So his most highly classified assignment was to measure the Earth's gravitational pull in the Mediterranean off North Africa so that a missile, one from a submarine, say, could be fired accurately. The cover story for the small freighter Wilson bought was that the ship was searching for undersea oil deposits. After the months-long survey was completed, Wilson received a lot of kudos from his superiors. He also made a lot of money. He had seen he had seen to it that the oil exploration part of the secret project was completed, and he sold the data to several petroleum companies. Interesting. So meanwhile, he continued to enlarge his Mount Airy holdings, eventually possessing 2,338 acres of lush, rolling, white fenced land, upon which show horses roamed and black Angus cattle grazed. A long, curving driveway led up to the three-story main house. The basement contained a pool room, a sauna, and a steam bath. And on the ground floor, in addition to the panel living and dining rooms and library, there was a huge kitchen lined with handcrafted cherry wood cabinets. Of the kitchen, an appraiser familiar with stately residences in the area said, "To be honest, I have not seen a kitchen as elaborately finished as this one." Wilson kept a perpetual open house. Former Vice President Humphrey would come on occasion, as would congressmen like Sylvia O. Conte of Massachusetts, John M. Murphy of New York, Charles Wilson of Texas, of Charlie Wilson's War, right? And John D. Dignall of Michigan. Senators like Strom Thurmond of South Carolina and John Stennis of Mississippi, all there to enjoy the elaborate barbecues, the riding, hunting, and fishing. But the people Wilson most wanted to charm and seduce were Capitol Hill aides, anonymous admirals and generals, civil service employees at the highest government grades, GS 17 and 18. No one was more important to him than a GS 18. Politicians and political appointees come and go, but as permanent government employees, GS 18 stayed on, savvy insiders executing policy, if not indeed forming it. Interesting. So think about that. Wow. So take a little break here, right? So Charles Wilson. So let me look this guy up real quick. So wow, he also had ties to Charles Wilson, which means that he had ties likely to the clandestine funding of the Mujahideen, which also involved people like General John Singlaub, right? So a lot of these people are floating in the same circles. So Charles Wilson. So Wilson is best known for leading Congress in supporting Operation Cyclone, the largest ever Central Intelligence Agency covert operation, which during the Carter and Reagan administration supplied military equipment to the Afghan Mujahideen during the Soviet-Afghan War. Very interesting. So you see here. Pause real quick. Wow, so this is Charlie Wilson. So let me see here. So his behind-the-scene campaign was subject to the nonfiction book Charlie Wilson's War: The Extraordinary Story of the Largest Covert Operation in History. And of course, they made the movie adaptation with Tom Hanks, right? Even though there's a lot of scrutiny, I think um, behind the actual details of that movie. Like they kind of dolled it up to make it seem better than what it was. There was a lot of like some covert kind of drug smuggling activity in Afghanistan at the time. Um, so let me see here. Interesting. So between 1956 and 1960s, Wilson served the United States Navy, obtaining the rank of lieutenant and serving as a gunnery officer on the USS John W. Weeks DD 701. He was assigned to the Pentagon as part of the Office of Naval Intelligence unit that evaluated Soviet Union nuclear forces. Interesting. So Charlie Wilson, right? So we'll come back to him later on. So back to the article, right? So he hosted, all these senators at Edwin Wilson hosted all these senators at his estate, right? But he particularly wanted to do work with GS-18s, who are like the highest ranking civil service you can have, because they don't seem to actually go away. They're just like permanent employees. So others gathered at Mount Airy as well. One was Wilson's old case officer, Thomas Clines. Another was Theodore G. Shackley, who had been in charge of CIA stations in Miami, Laos, and South Vietnam, and who was widely considered to be a surefire candidate for the CIA's directorship someday. A third was a decorated Air Force officer, Richard Secord, who, as a general, was to become chief Middle Eastern arms cell advisor um, to Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger. Caspar Weinberger appears in the Iran-Contra scandal, and he was later pardoned by George Bush because of that, right? So, like I'm saying, the Blonde Ghost Network, Bay of Pigs, all this stuff in the 70s going on, the cowboy years, all the cocaine and drug trafficking that would culminate in Iran-Contra, it's all connected, effectively. Still, a fourth was Erich F. Von Marbod, who, after a distinguished Pentagon career, would be appointed director of the United States Defense Security Assistance Agency. Interesting. So we go back to our little schematic here, scroll up to the top. Yep, so we got all this. So it's Thomas Shackley, Edwin Wilson, Thomas Clines, and Richard Secord. So remember, Thomas Clines was effectively Edwin Wilson's supervisor at the Office of Special Operations in the CIA. So that's interesting there. So they shared a special camaraderie. Clines had worked for Shackley in Miami and Laos. In Laos, Secord had been an ace spotter pilot in the CIA's secret war against the communist Pathet Lao, and in Vietnam, Von Marbod and Shackley had been in close contact. As they relaxed around Wilson's pool at Mount Airy, they all saw that he could do something they couldn't, which was to make money. Soon they had another common bond. All four would be listed in Wilson's secret code book of names when he began his terrorist operations for Colonel Gaddafi. Interesting. So let me pause real quick. All right, so the first mention of Wilson in the press was in 1977 when a story in the Washington Post erroneously linked him to the bomb murder of Orlando Letelier, the former Chilean ambassador who had become a leading critic of the military dictatorship that overthrew his government. The story identified Wilson as an ex-CIA operative and also noted that he reportedly had links with Gaddafi's Libya. Very interesting. Makes you think like who leaked that, to the press. Let me pause real quick. All right, so I actually just looked up Orlando Orlando Letelier. And what's interesting is that so he was a critic of Augusto Pinochet, right? We all know that Augusto Pinochet was the right-wing fascist dictator propped up by the CIA. Um, um, that's a very notable thing, right? They overthrew Salvador Allende, the democratically elected president of Chile, who, unfortunately for him, he was a socialist, so he obviously had the target of the United States and CIA on his back. Um, so we all know about that whole situation. A lot of people are interested in this history, but so agents of Pinochet in the uh, Dirección de Inteligencia Nacional, the DINA, Chile's version of the CIA, tracked down Orlando and blew up his car with him inside. And the agents had been working, so the DINA members had also been working with members of the Coordination of United Revolutionary Organizations, which was an anti-Castro militant group. So then you start going down the rabbit hole through this conspiracy theory. Too interestingly, you come full circle back to the Cuban Bay of Pig veterans. Some of those veterans and some of those expatriates who had learned deadly skills being trained by the CIA during the Bay of Pigs invasion. A lot of them created splinter groups after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, like Alpha 66, Cuban Power, etc. And they were involved in anti-communist terrorism across Latin America. And some of them were even sent to the Congo under the CIA, under people like Rip Robertson. And Rip Robertson was actually the CIA military person who led the Cubans on their beach invasion into Cuba. So a lot of those veterans from the Bay of Pigs were in Africa, but then they were also back in Latin America doing anti-communist activities. Um, so that's a whole another rabbit hole that you can kind of go down. Let me see here. Yeah, here we go. So, for example, the Coordination of United Revolutionary Organizations. So it was founded by Orlando Bosch and Luis Posada Carriles, both of whom worked with the CIA at various times, and was composed chiefly of Cuban exiles opposed to the Cuban government. So we have right here Luis Posada Carriles being with his photo at Fort Benning, Georgia. Interesting, right? Then also Orlando Bosch. So, and a lot of these guys or people associated with them also kind of got involved in the cocaine smuggling of the 1980s. That's why Miami was popping the way it was. Um, so there's that. So that's very interesting there. Wow. So let's go back to the article, right? So it's interesting. So Wilson's name, so he was kind of like under the radar for a long time, right? He kind of got his start kind of in the Korean War era, and up until 1977, you can almost say like, geez, almost 20 years. He was just kind of under the radar, kind of living his best life, really. As this kind of deep state spook operative doing some really gnarly stuff for the CIA. But somehow his name got out into the media in 1977. And according to this, they say in this Times article that the Washington Post erroneously linked him to the bomb murder of Orlando Letelier, which is very interesting because based on what I know about Edwin P. Wilson, I don't know if it's erroneous. Based on some of the people he was working with, like Frank Terpil, who was giving like weapons to like Idi Amin and like Bokassa and the Grey Wolves and Italian neo-fascists and stuff like that. Some pretty gnarly stuff. Um, but anyways, based on that assassination of Orlando Letelier, like I said, we can kind of go down the rabbit hole and trace his assassins to DINA, who were the Chilean intelligence, and then they also had support from Cuban terrorist groups, and some of those Cubans were alumni of the Bay of Pigs invasion. And now we're kind of going into the rabbit hole of the JFK assassination, possibly, et cetera, et cetera. So, but what caught the eye of Admiral? So I'm reading now back the article by Peter Mass. So, but what caught the eye of Admiral Stansfield Turner, President Carter's newly appointed CIA director, was that Wilson may have had contact with one or more current CIA employees. When he arrived at the CIA's Langley headquarters, Turner demanded to know who Wilson's contacts were. To his chagrin, just about everybody, it appeared, except him, knew about them. One was William, i.e., Bill Weisenberger, whose job was to acquire exotic equipment for the agency, and who had supplied Wilson with 10 miniature detonators of the most advanced design. The second CIA man, Patry Loomis, while operating under deep commercial cover in the Far East, had been discovered only a few months earlier working for Wilson on the side. Wiesenberger told Wiesenberger, Turner was told, had already received a reprimand, and Loomis would probably get the same treatment. That's pretty mild, isn't it? Turner asked. Shouldn't we be getting rid of them? But to his amazement, Turner found a solid wall of opposition from his top deputy, who was a longtime CIA professional, from the chief of the clandestine services, and most surprisingly, from the CIA's inspector general. Wiesenberger has simply been duped into doing a favor for an old friend, and Loomis was just moonlighting, not unheard of among agency personnel. It wasn't such a big deal. CIA relationships were complex. This wasn't the Navy. Turner, however, was looking for a way to make his presence felt. The day of the free-wheeling covert cowboys, as he put it, was over, and he ordered the firing of both Loomis and Wiesenberger. He convened 500 CIA officials in the bubble, the auditorium at the agency's Langley headquarters, and advised them that Wilson was persona non grata. He was sent a quote-unquote book cable, a CIA message to agency stations around the world, warning them not to have any dealings with Wilson. Wilson, Turner said, had been abusing his past affiliations with the agency, and he ordered agency employees to report back to Langley any approaches Wilson may have made. As Turner probed further, he learned of Wilson's close ties to Ted Shackley and Tom Clines. By now, Shackley, as the number two man in the CIA's Directorate of Operations, occupied one of the agency's most sensitive positions. Turner also knew that if Gerald Ford had defeated Carter in 1976 presidential elections, Shackley would probably be sitting in his chair. So now we have some political, jockeying going around, right? Whose stick is bigger than whose type competition, right? So, in a private meeting, Shackley told Turner that his connection with Wilson was purely social, and that while he had spent weekends at Mount Airy, it was mainly because his wife and Wilson's were such good friends. He had never spoken to Wilson about the slightest professional matter. Turner didn't believe him, but the most he felt he could do at the time was to take Shackley out of clandestine operations and appoint him deputy head of National Intelligence Tasking Center, whose mission to coordinate intelligence gathering sounded more important than it really was. Turner found Clines even less credible. During the investigation of Patry Loomis, Clines had been spotted at a table with Loomis and Wilson in a coffee shop not far from Langley. Clines claimed it was happenstance encounter. He said, dropped in for a solitary breakfast, seen the two men, and sat with them. Since the inspector general, who came out of the clandestine branch himself, had exonerated Clines of any purposeful wrongdoing, Turner's hands were pretty much tied. So, in gathering information for my book, I asked Turner if he had taken any action at all against Clines. He recalled with some satisfaction that he had determined at least to remove Clines from the Washington scene and ordered him assigned to a small Caribbean nation. Which one, I inquired, I can't tell you, is classified. So interesting. So let me read that again. In gathering information for my book, I asked Turner if he had taken any actions against Clines. He recalled with some satisfaction that he had determined at least to remove Clines from the Washington scene and order him assigned to a small Caribbean nation. Which one, I inquired, I can't tell you, is classified. So that's very interesting, right? I think we might know which one that is. So let me look that up real quick. Actually, never mind. I thought I was gonna be able to look that up real quick. But let me see here. So back to the article. So basically, so to recap. Oh, here we go. I told Turner that I thought I had a record of every post Clines had served with the CIA, and no Caribbean nation was mentioned. But still, he said, "I'm sorry, I can't help you." I then told one of my agency sources about my encounter with Turner. "Oh, right," he said, "it was Jamaica. Except Clines never went." "He never went?" "No." Clines had been removed as the head of the CIA's Office of Training, all right. But he ended up in an equally sensitive spot at the agency's Pentagon as the agency's Pentagon liaison. Interesting. And Turner still didn't know about it. It was a perfect illustration of how the quote unquote company could run rings around the director when it felt like it. Even a director who was a former Rhodes Scholar, fresh from commanding the North Atlantic Treaty Organization forces in Southern Europe. Wow. So eventually, on bulletin boards at CIA headquarters, anonymous notices went up likening Turner to Captain Queeg. Um, so Edwin Wilson first met Frank E. Terpil at a 1975 Christmas party for current and former intelligence operatives in Bathsheba, Maryland. Terpil was a CIA communications man who had been phased out under a cloud, suspected, among other things, of using diplomatic pouches to smuggle contraband. So Terpil obviously knew plenty about Wilson and told him that he had a really good hook into Libya through Gaddafi's first cousin, Syed Gaddafadam, who was handling military procurement out of the Libyan embassy in London. His connection, Terpil said, was this Pennsylvania guy, Joseph McElroy, one of the earliest entrepreneurs to cash in on the money flush oil nations in Africa and the Middle East. Hmm. So interesting. So interesting. So his connections, Terpil said, was this Pennsylvania guy, Joseph McElroy, one of the earliest entrepreneurs to cash in on the money flush oil nations in Africa and the Middle East. McElroy began supplying everything from Pampers to pistols. Gradually, his best customer became Libya, and Pampers yielded more and more to pistols. Terpil had just helped McElroy bring 50 handguns to London embassy, and now McElroy wanted out. In 1984, the world was treated on television and in the press to the picture of a young British policewoman sprawled mortally wounded on the street, cut down by a fusillade of shots from Libya's London embassy during an anti-Gaddafi demonstration. Britain broke diplomatic relations with Libya, and after an 11-day standoff, the Libyans in the embassy were forced to leave the country. Um, a search of the embassy then turned up several American guns with discharge chambers, and though it was never announced publicly, they were traced by the Bureau, the ATF, to the shipment Terpil had helped deliver. In the fall of 1976, wow, so that's interesting. So wow, so Terpil. So I'm summarizing now. So Wilson meets Terpil. Terpil was a communications guy, the CIA, who eventually got kind of kicked out or whatever. And I'm gonna show later a part of the documentary of Frank Terpil, Confessions of a Dangerous Man, or whatnot. Um, and it's interesting. So he helped ship guns to the Libyan embassy in London. Wow. But those guns, I'm thinking, was this that infamous Special Air Service raid on the Libyan embassy? I wonder. Actually, 1 minute. All right, so I was confused. I thought it was the 1980s Iranian embassy SAS hostage type situation. But actually, I never knew about this one. It was the shooting death of Yvonne Fletcher, and actually you have Gaddafi over here apologizing for it. Interestingly, so face of Yvonne Fletcher murder suspect. So it looks like, based off of this article, that some of the munitions that Frank Terpil helped smuggle with the help of Joseph McElroy um, into London, some of those weapons may have actually been used, unfortunately, to kill this young policewoman. So she was cut down um, by shots of Libya's London embassy during an anti-Gaddafi demonstration. Jeez, wow. And then Britain broke off diplomatic relations because of that. Very interesting. Wow. So that's a whole nother thing. Actually, I want to write that down real quick. Jeez. So Frank Terpil, Yvonne Fletcher. All right. So a search of the embassy then turned up several American guns, and the ATF eventually tracked those back to Terpil. So in the fall of 1976, Wilson and Terpil set up a bomb factory for the Libyans about 25 miles south of Tripoli. He supplied a variety of explosives and programmable detonators, along with a cadre of instructions that included an ex-CIA explosives man and then two technicians on leave from a secret Navy weapons testing facility, and two Army bomb disposal experts whose services had been often used by the United States Secret Service on presidential security details. Years later, when one of the Army men, a sergeant, was questioned by federal authorities, he said, tears sliding down his face, "I don't know why I did it. I guess it was the money." Wilson also got an inkling of the riches in store for him. His principal contact was Major Abdullah Hajazi of Libyan military intelligence. For his first payment of $350,000 in cash, Wilson dispatched an employee, Douglas M. Slatcher, to Hajaji's headquarters. Slasher was ushered into a vault-lined room, and a drawer was pulled out with packed up $100 bills. Wow, so that's another name. We need to take down here. These. Okay, so Douglas Slatcher. So 1 minute. Wow. So when it was learned that the money was for deposit in Switzerland, Slatcher was asked if Swiss francs wouldn't be more convenient. And when he said he guessed so, another drawer was opened, filled with them. And then he was shown other drawers loaded with French francs, German marks, British pounds. You see, he told, we have whatever you want. The same Hajjajis today is Libya's liaison with the infamous Abu Nidal Palestinian terrorist group, which is said to be responsible for the wholesale slaughter of passengers at airports in Rome and Vienna, and most recently was implicated in the bombings of a TWA flight to Athens this month. The initial cash payments caused an almost immediate split between Wilson and Terpil. So the initial cash payments caused almost immediate split Wilson and Terpil when Wilson discovered that his partner was skimming. So let me see something here. Wow, that's wild. And what's crazier too, is that I have some more notes in which that Abdu Nidal Palestinian organization, interestingly, might actually have links to Nazi war criminals. Um, for example, there's a good documentary called The Other Face of Terror, released in 1984 by Channel 4, also known as Inside Europe's Neo-Nazi Network, right? And these Palestinians, I want to believe, who were in this Abdu Nidal Palestinian terrorist group. So let me see here. Terrorists at the 1969 Zurich airport trying to harm Israelis. So the lawyer for them, interestingly, was a person named, or I think one of the persons who helped bail them out or help for their legal defense was a Swiss pro-Hitler lawyer named Francois Genot, who had links to a person named, what's his name? Uh, Jacques Verges, who was a lawyer, and I want to say he was also the lawyer who oversaw the criminal defense for Klaus Barbie, the Nazi butcher of Lyon, who was living in Bolivia, who was later extradited back to France. Very interesting. Um, so I want to say that what's interesting is a lot of Nazi groups created sympathies with Palestinian and jihadist terrorist organizations because of their common dislike of the Jews. So think about that, right? So Frank Terpil and Edwin Wilson, via their ties to Libya, via their ties to Hajjaji has ties to these Palestinian groups, and the Palestinian groups are getting some sort of legal support in Europe when captured by underground clandestine neo-Nazi organizations who have sympathies because they're anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic. So that's very interesting. Wow. Wow. So let me see something here. So wow. Let me pause this real quick. All right, so let me see here. So the initial cash payments the initial cash payments caused an almost immediate split between Wilson and Turple when Wilson discovered that his partner was skimming. As much as 10% of each payment was found to be missing by the time the money reached Switzerland. Wilson told Hajaji, or yeah, that Turple claimed the missing money went for bribes he had to pay Libyan officials, among them Hajaji, and Terpil was ordered out of the country. So, what the Libyans most yearned was the American made composition C4, a whitish putty like explosive of enormous power, which was under the strictest export controls. Its main ingredient, called RDX, is unmatched in destructive potential save for nuclear weapons. Commercially, explosives made of RDX were in demand for demolition projects because of their malleability and the way their force could be directed. The same features made RDX a favorite for terrorists to blow up a building, preferably in Israel, or a car, or for turning ordinary household items, an ashtray, a lamp, a radio, into instruments of death. The versatility of RDX didn't stop there. It could be manufactured in sheets, usually a foot wide and a quarter-inch thick. The sheets were pliable and could be cut to any desired size or shape. A classic terrorist tactic was to mail such an explosive in an envelope wired to a miniature detonator. When the recipient opened the envelope flap, he or she was torn apart. So if Wilson could supply C4, Hajaji told him the sky was the limit on other contracts. And on April 2nd, 1977, 500 pounds of C4 hidden in cans of DAP glazing compound left Los Angeles aboard a Lufthansa flight bound for Frankfurt, where it was transferred to another flight destined for Tripoli. Exactly 6 months later, on October 2nd, a charter DC-8 took off from Houston, laden with a staggering 21 tons of C4 hidden in cans labeled as oil drilling mud. It was the biggest private shipment of explosives in history, and it was going to the center of the world of terrorism, Gaddafi's Libya, on the orders of Edwin P. Wilson. Once Hajaji was able to finger a chunk of C4 at a bomb factory Wilson was operating, to smile at the prospect of the bodies it would dismember, he was as good as his word about additional contracts. For $8 million a year, Wilson was asked to supply restricted parts for Gaddafi's fleet of American made C-130 military transport planes and another 1.2 million American and British pilots to fly them. He received an order for long-range surveillance vans destined for desert patrols and equipped with day-night vision TV cameras that had the image intensification tube whose unregulated export was forbidden by federal law. In between social events, Edwin demonstrated one of the cameras for Libyan intelligence officers right at Mount Airy's Farms. So he entered into an agreement to provide veterans of the United States Special Forces Green Berets to train commando teams. The Libyans paid $100,000 per Green Beret. Wilson in turn recruited each of them for half as much. The Berets were a natural choice for Wilson. For years, the CIA had been using special forces on covert missions that required military expertise, and the way he would frame it, this would appear to be just another officially sanctioned operation. The first batch of former Green Berets, 4 of them, toting war bags, were met by Wilson in Switzerland in Zurich's Airport International Zone. He took them to a coffee shop. They would later recall how impressed they were by him. He was their kind of guy, tough, down-to-earth, authoritative. He told them they were going into Libya. I want you to ingratiate yourselves with those people, get in tight with them, whatever it requires. One of the Green Berets had participated in many CIA missions in Southeast Asia, and that included the assassination of suspected Viet Cong sympathizers and secret search and destroy attacks in Cambodia. He remembers thinking that this sounded like an infiltration mission. There were no signed contracts, Wilson said. If I Welsh, you'll come looking to kill me. If you Welsh, I'll come after you. That's our contract. You got any questions? Who are we working for? Me, said Wilson, and they appreciated how professionally cryptic his response was. Nothing more was necessary. No elaborate explanations. No pep talks. And the truth was that this was no weirder than dozens of agency ventures they had known about in the past. Wow, and the truth was this was no weirder than dozens of agency ventures they had known in the past. Before Wilson was through, he would bring in more than 100 ex-berets, Marine black belt karate masters, and pilot instructors for Libya's American-made Chinook cargo and troop-carrying helicopters. He then contracted to outfit one of Gaddafi's pet projects, a 3,500-man mobile strike force, from combat boots to heavy machine guns. The weaponry added up to $23 million. By bringing in a Pentagon intelligence analyst, Wilson was able to supply Hajaji with a variety of top-secret documents, including contingency plans for the Army's 82nd Airborne Division in case of trouble in the Middle East. And when Hajaji asked for a few American guns to be delivered to Libyan embassies here and there, Wilson threw them in at no extra charge. During 1979 and 1980, 11 anti-Gaddafi Libyans were murdered in Europe. One of them, newly married with an infant daughter and living in West Germany, was shot in the back while exiting from an underpass at the Bonn railroad station. The weapon, a .35-7 Magnum, was recovered and traced back to Fayetteville, North Carolina, where it had been purchased by a former Green Beret working for Wilson. What? Wow, this is crazy. So on January 11th, 1979, Thomas Clines met in Geneva with Wilson's attorney, Edward Coughlin. Clines had resigned from the CIA, and Shackley would do so shortly. Clines had set up a company specializing in security and was about to form another one to be incorporated in Bermuda. In both firms, Clines was the president and Shackley would be listed as a consultant. In Geneva, Clines presented Coughlin with a handwritten summary of a loan proposal. Among its points was a Liberian corporation not identified with Wilson would transfer money to a custodial account in Bermuda. If I understood correctly, Coughlin wrote Wilson in a January 18th memo, it is proposed that an offshore corporation be organized with eventually 5 equal shareholders. 4 of these 20% shareholders are individual U.S. citizens, and the fifth would be a foreign corporation not controlled by U.S. persons. So in February, $500,000 was sent to Bermuda in 2 installments. Later, Wilson confined to his mistress, Roberta J. Barnes, whose code name in Wilson organization was Wonder Woman, was that his unnamed partners were Cline, Shackley, the Pentagon's Erich Von Marbod, and Air Force General Secord. The $500,000, he said, was seed money for a company that would make millions shipping American arms to Egypt. All right, I'm gonna take a break. I'm almost curious. I mean, I doubt they have a picture of her, but how does Roberta J. Barnes even look? Okay, so Egypt, as a result of the Camp David peace accords, was going to get boatloads of military aid worth roughly $1 billion a year. And in an unparalleled move, Washington agreed to advance the money to ship these armaments. For anybody in the freight forwarding business who could get a lock on the contract, the bonanza would be extraordinary. Von Marbod, i.e., Redhead, in Wilson's code book, had the job of making sure the arm cells go off to a fast, smooth start. Unexpectedly, though, an Egyptian named Hussein K. Salim showed up with a letter signed by Egypt's defense minister authorizing him to handle the shipments. Von Marbod refused on the grounds that Salim had no visible track record as a port freighter. Then Salam formed a corporate partnership with Clines called the Egyptian American Transportation and Services Corporation, EATSCO for short. Like magic, an exclusive contract with EATSCO was approved. By the spring of 1980, Wilson was an indicted fugitive and thus unable to operate from his usual bases in the United States, Britain, and Switzerland. Holed up in Libya, he sent a former Green Beret to warn Clines that he wanted his 500,000 back or else. And eventually he was repaid. The same Green Beret, Eugene Tafoya, was dispatched by Wilson on a request from Hajaji to assassinate a dissident student, a Libyan student in Colorado. The student, although blinded in one eye, survived. Tafoya was apprehended and sentenced to 2 years imprisonment for assault and criminal conspiracy. In explaining why Tafoya had escaped conviction on charges of attempted murder, one juror cited confusion of Tafoya's claim that he had been working for the CIA. What? What? I gotta pause real quick. We gotta look this up. Wow. All right. So that's wild. I want to read this over again. So by the spring of 1980, Wilson was an indicted fugitive and thus unable to operate from his usual bases in the United States, Britain, and Switzerland. Holed up in Libya, he sent a former Green Beret to warn Clines, in other words, intimidate Clines, that he wanted his $500,000 back or else. And eventually he was repaid. The same Green Beret, Eugene Tafoya, was dispatched by Wilson on a request from Hajaji to assassinate a Libyan dissident in Colorado. The student, although blinded in one eye, survived. Tafoya was apprehended and sentenced to 2 years in imprisonment for assault and criminal conspiracy. In explaining why Tafoya had escaped conviction on the charges of attempted murder, one juror cited confusion over Tafoya's claim that he had been working for the CIA. Roberta Barnes later repeated to federal authorities what Wilson had told her, but there was, as they say, no smoking gun. No evidence of a criminal conflict of interest would stand up in court. Clines said that his unnamed American partners didn't exist. They were simply John Does required for the filing of incorporation papers. Shackley said that he didn't know any of the details of what Clines was doing. Von Marbod's denial of wrongdoing was absolute. The same went for Secord. On January 1st, 1981, von Marbod ended a brilliant Defense Department career, citing narcolepsy. Secord also cut his military career short, resigning in 1983. So the Egyptian government, for its part, exhibited little doubt that Edwin P. Wilson, a man now being publicly identified with Libya, Egypt's bitterest foe in the Arab world, had been involved in Itzko, and Sudan Salim was ordered to cut all relations with Clines. So, on top of everything, the United States government auditors finally determined that Itzko, during the period when Clines was still a visible partner, had fraudulently billed the Pentagon for some $8 million. In a plea bargain, Clines got off with $100,000 in corporate fines and received a letter informing him that no further indictments against him were contemplated. While it was also announced that Salim had paid more than $3 million in claims and fines, United States-Egyptian relations were at a tender stage following the assassination of President Anwar el-Sadat, and I discovered that in a sealed court document, the $3 million was immediately credited back to Egypt. So while it was also announced that Salam had, so let me read that again. While it was also announced that Salam had paid more than $3 million in claims and fines, the $3 million was immediately credited back to Israel or to Egypt. So it is more than conceivable that Wilson himself would be a large or be at large today aiding Gaddafi had it not been for a young assistant United States Attorney in Washington named E. Lawrence Barcella the Jr. While Wilson was operating unrestrained in Libya, the FBI conducted a 14-month investigation into his activities and in a report dated November 17, 1977 concluded, with Justice Department concurrence, that he committed no prosecutable crimes. By accident, Barcella read the report and with growing indignation began to consider its implications. If Wilson can get away without punishment, how many others might soon be involved in the same sort of activity, or perhaps were involved already? Often in the face of official indifference, Barcella began a relentless pursuit of Wilson that lasted for nearly 4 years over 3 continents in America, Britain, West Germany, Switzerland, Libya, and finally the Dominican Republic. It was like a western. The lawman after the outlaw, one on one toward a final confrontation. The chase was personal in every sense of the word. The two men met secretly in Italy in a temporary truce. They corresponded and talked over international telephone lines, trying to outwit each other. Barcella's marriage would be severely strained, his life disrupted by countless ways, vacation wiped out. Uh, Saturday became just another working day, taking him away from his young daughter upon whom he doted. He began waking up in the middle of the night, wondering where Wilson was at the moment and what he was thinking, what he was plotting. A friend of Barcella's had seen the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid on television. In the movie, the principals, having robbed one train too many, are tracked down by a dogged sheriff whose trademark hat is a white skimmer. Wherever the two outlaws go, despite every stratagem they can devise, they always find themselves on some hilltop, looking back into growing amazement, alarm, and anger at a shimmering white dot, the sheriff's skimmer, following them in the distance. It was known that one of Wilson's favorite pastimes in his Tripoli villa was watching taped movies. Boy, said Barkella's friend, if he got that picture in his library, it'll really give him the willies. So, using international confidence man as a go-between, Barcella at last devised a plan to entice Wilson out of his Libyan sanctuary. After 10 months of tense maneuvering, Wilson was lured to the Dominican Republic, where, by prearrangement, he was denied entry and placed on a flight to the United States. On June 15th, 1982, Wilson was unable to comprehend quite what happened to him, was arraigned in federal court in Brooklyn in a series of trials that followed. He was sentenced to 32 years in prison on a variety of weapon smuggling charges. Still in custody, Wilson tried to strike back, believing that he was hiring the services of the Aryan Brotherhood, the vicious gang of killers operating both inside and outside of prison. He made a down payment to kill Barcella, as well as other prosecutors and other key witnesses, prosecution witnesses. The proposed price on Barcella's head was $250,000, but a prison informant was a party to the plot, and Wilson was subsequently convicted on multiple counts of conspiracy to commit murder, bringing his total sentence to 52 years. He cannot reasonably expect consideration for parole for about 18 years. What has not been disclosed is that Wilson tried again to do away with Barcella. While he was being held at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York City, he met another inmate, Willam Arico, a professional mafia hitman. Arico was awaiting extradition to Italy for an assassination he had carried out there while in the employ of the Italian financial swindler Michele Sidona. Whoa. Let me pause that real quick. All right, so I just wanted to pull something up here. So if we go back to this article, so let's reread some stuff real quick, right? So still in custody, Wilson tried to strike back, believing that he was hiring the services of the Aryan Brotherhood, the vicious gang of killers operating both inside and outside prison. He made a down payment to kill Barcella, as well as another prosecutor and several key prosecution witnesses. The promised price for Barcella's head was $250,000, but a prison informant was part was party to the plot, and Wilson was subsequently convicted on multiple accounts of conspiracy to commit murder, bringing his total sentence to 52 years. He cannot reasonably expect consideration for parole for about 18 years. So what was not disclosed is that Wilson tried again to do away with Barcella. While he was being held at the Metropolitan Center in New York City, he met another inmate, Willam Arico, a professional mafia hitman. Arico um, was awaiting extradition to Italy for an assassination he carried out there while in the employ of Italian financial swindler Michele Sidona. The reason why I wanted to pause real quick is because I did another note taking little thing I did, and this is called Banco Ambrosiano. So it even connects to that because we go down here. Roberto Calvi had ties to Michele Sidona of Franklin National Bank, who had ties to the mafia, through people like Giuseppe Callo of the Italian Porto Nova family and the Banda della Margura. And he also had ties to the Gambino crime family, one of the five families of New York. And Graham Martin, U.S. ambassador, had them by the Daily American. So Michele Sidona was like a banker like Roberto Calvi. And interesting, Roberto Calvi was a member of the P2 Masonic Lodge, that included people like Bunga Bunga, Silvio Berlusconi, Prince Victor Emmanuel, one of the pretenders to the Italian throne, I think, of the House of Savoy. And he goes on and everything. So think about that. So now we're jumping over to the Banco Ambrosiano and the whole Vatican bank scandal and everything too, which allegedly might have some ties to Iran Contra itself, because a person named Francisco uh, Panzina uh, talked about how like a group of American Sauds and an Iranian wanted to buy, I think, the remnants of the Banco Ambrosiano Bank for $1.2 billion, largely to help facilitate um, their arms smuggling during Iran Contra, potentially. So I just wanted to bring that up here. This is like another thing I want to do. The Banco Ambrosiano scandal. So very interesting, right? And Pope John Paul, of course, shot by Medaka. So then we're back to our other Belongos Network thing up here with Frank Terpil and Edwin Wilson. So we get kind of crazy, you know. It's like I'm not saying that it's all necessarily connected like in sequential order, but it's like all these people, because they're operating in the clandestine black markets of the globe, you know, they're just a few degrees of separation away from each other. So it's like this just underbelly of society basically. All right, so back to the article. So Arico was planning an escape, and Wilson arrived to give him $550,000 in cash. The money in English pounds was passed to Arico's wife in a hotel at London's Heathrow's airport. So wow. So along with two accomplices, Arico attempted an escape down sheets tied together from the upper floor of the center. The first man landed safely, and Arico had just 6 feet to go when the third, an overweight Cuban drug dealer, caught his belt buckle in the sheets after coming out of the window and plummeted on top of Arico, surviving himself but crushing Arico to death in the process. After Wilson's after Wilson's arrest, there was a flurry of soul searching in the CIA. How about how best to prevent a repetition of the sort of activity? As this and other newspapers have noted, there appears to be a new kind of intelligence trader, operatives who, like Wilson, are motivated by greed rather than ideology, and who, as Parcella notes, are patriots until cash gets in the way. Given the agency's present structure and its continued emphasis on covert operations, and with secrecy and compartmentalization more in vogue than ever, many of the elements that permitted Wilson to launch his career with terrorists remain difficult to change. But even modest proposals to require, for instance, that former members of the intelligence community register any relationships with foreign governments, companies, or individuals has gone by the boards. When I asked Stanley Sporkin, the CIA's general counsel who recently resigned to become a federal judge, that happened to such reforms, he insisted that he knew no organized opposition to them. There were just more important things to focus on, he said. In the meantime, um, in the meantime, Lawrence Barcella, in conjunction with the Criminal Division of the Justice Department, had been conducting grand jury investigations concerning the hijackers of TWA Flight 847 last summer and cruise ship Achille Loro last fall, in hope, however slim, that they will be apprehended. And whenever terrorist bombs go off in a Paris delicatessen, for instance, or a London department store, or on this month's TWA flight, where plastic explosives are thought to have been used, he links that to the huge store of C4 that Wilson brought to Gaddafi's Libya in 1977. It has a shelf life of 20 years. Peter Mast is the author of the Valachi Papers and Serpico and other works. This article is adapted from Manhunt to be published next month by Random House. Wow, great article. So, with that being said, not too many photos of Edwin Wilson, but so that's what he looked like right there. And I think if we go to his bio, so he actually died in Seattle, Washington in 2012. Um, wow, what a interesting story article that was. So there's some interesting other things here too. So so there's some more information actually in the Wikipedia article that they don't really talk about, right? So Edwin Wilson was a former CIA and Office of Naval Intelligence officer who was convicted in 1983 of illegally selling weapons to Libya. It was later found that the United States Department of Justice had relied on false affidavits when prosecuting Wilson, and as a result, Wilson's convictions were overturned in 2003, and he was freed the following year. So when Edwin P. Wilson was born into a poor family in Nampa, Idaho, in 1928, he worked as a merchant seaman. In 1953, he earned a degree in psychology degree from the University of Portland. That same year, Wilson joined the Marines and fought in the last days of the Korean War. He is said to have been impressive during his military service, and he was discharged in 1956 for a knee injury, and then he went to go work for the Central Intelligence Agency. So Wilson's first assignments were for the Office of Security. His stint included the 1956 guarding of the U-2 spy plane in Turkey. In 1960, the agency sent him to Cornell University for graduate studies in labor relations. He put his knowledge of psychology to use in the agency's international organizations division, tackling communism and trade unions around the world. Wilson was involved in attempts to destabilize European labor unions, for example, by using methods as diversive as involving Corsican mobsters and using plagues of cockroaches. So Wilson was on the CIA's payroll and doing the agency's bidding. All the time he was employed by one of the largest labor unions in the United States as its international representative in Europe. He served as an advance man for Herbert H. Humphrey in 1964. So Herbert Humphrey was the vice president to Lyndon B. Johnson. He supported the Vietnam War. So he was an advance man for Herbert Humphrey in 1964 campaign, thus playing an active role in partisan politics while working for the CIA. However, Wilson's most valuable time for the CIA was in the Special Operations Division, setting up front companies like Maritime Consulting Associates in 1964 and Consultants International in 1965, which were used to covertly ship supplies around the world. For example, cargoes included disassembled boats sent to Central Africa, where they were welded together on the shores of Lake Tanganyika, and used to intercept Soviet arms being ferried across the lake to rebels in Congo, arms to Angola, crowd control gear to Chile, Brazil, and Venezuela, all kinds of intelligence gathering facilities in Iran, or excuse me, supplies for a group of dissident army officers planning a coup in Indonesia and barges into Vietnam. As director of these firms, which were conducted as legitimate businesses, Wilson began to amass a lot of money, but as a contractor, not as an employee. He invested in property around the world. In 1971, after 15 years with the CIA, events that have been disputed ended Wilson's official career there. He nevertheless received a year's pay and acquired ownership of some of his front companies. So in 1971, with the CIA's knowledge and approval, Wilson moved to the Office of Naval Intelligence, where he worked full-time for a secret intelligence unit called Naval Field Operations Support Group, or Task Force 157. Between its inception in 1966 and its termination in 1977, the focus was on acquiring intelligence on Soviet naval activity. However, the unit's remit was wider and later described as the U.S. military's only network of undercover agents and spies operating abroad, using commercial and business cover for their espionage. At this time, Wilson set up another front company, World Marine Inc., to assist with his logistics work. Wilson then retired from the ONI in 1976 after events that have been disputed. After a change in commanders, Wilson reportedly appealed to Admiral Bobby Inman, the Director of National Intelligence, offering his influence in Congress to the ONI's budget troubles if he, Wilson, could be made chief of Task Force 157. Allegedly outraged, Inman shut down Task Force 157 altogether and reported Wilson to the FBI. However, other calculations may have been in play. Wilson continued to run the businesses he had built under the guidance of the CIA, with the largest of which was Consultants International. He reportedly amassed a fortune of over $20 million through these businesses and continued to offer covert shipping services at the request of the CIA after his official retirement. Arms for Libya controversy. In the 1970s, he became involved in dealings with Libya. Wilson claimed that a high-ranking CIA official, Theodore Blanco Shackley, asked him to go to Libya to keep an eye on Carlos the Jackal, the infamous terrorist who was living there. At the time, a strict sanctions regime was in place against Libya, and the country was willing to pay a great deal for weapons and material. Wilson stated he began conducting elaborate dealings in guns and military uniforms were smuggled into the country. Wilson also recruited a group of Green Berets, decorated Vietnam veteran Billy Wall among them, to go to Libya and train as military intelligence officers. The Libyans used Wilson's provisions to advance their interests around the globe, including training terrorist cells to build explosive devices inside radios. Citation needed for that one, though. One cell trained by Wilson's operatives was the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine under Ahmad Jabril. Jabril was suspected of being behind the bombing of Pan Am 103 in Lockerbie, Scotland in 1988. In 1979, a gun that Wilson had arranged to be delivered to the Libyan embassy in Bonn was used to assassinate a prominent dissident. The next year, one of the Green Berets, used to assassinate another dissident in Colorado. Wilson states that he regrets these incidents and had no prior knowledge of them. He claimed that he was still working for the CIA despite the government's continued denials, and that his supplying of weapons to the Libyans was an attempt to get close to them and to gain valuable intelligence. This included attempts at gathering information on the Libyan nuclear program. Jeez. Okay, the most dramatic deal and the one that brought Wilson to the attention of the U.S. government was some 20 tons of military-grade C4 plastic explosives. This was a massive quantity that was equal to the entire U.S. domestic stockpile. Most of Wilson's connections were still under the impression that he was working for the CIA, and a wide network in the United States supported his actions. The explosives were presumed assembled by a California company and hidden in barrels of oil drilling mud. They were presumed flown to Libya aboard a chartered jet. So another scandal broke out around Wilson when a company he had formed to ship United States military aid to Libya was convicted of overcharging the United States Department of Defense by $8 million. A partner with Wilson in the company was a former CIA officer, Thomas G. Clines. Wilson also maintained that Major General Richard Secord was a silent partner in his company, though Secord denied the allegations. Nonetheless, Wilson, Clines, and Shackley and another former CIA officer were all working together with Secord in the summer of 1984 when Oliver North approached Secord to ask him to help buy arms for the Contras, a group of armed rebels then trying to overturn the leftist Sandinista government of Nicaragua. Jeez. So after a lengthy investigation by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, then part of the U.S. Department of Treasury, Wilson was indicted by the United States Justice Department for firearms and explosive violations. However, he was in Libya, which would not extradite him. Wilson was very unhappy in Libya. The Libyans were very suspicious of him, and he feared for his safety. The prosecutors, led by Lawrence Barcella, knew this, and they sent a con person with links to the CIA named Ernst Kreiser, who I want to talk about later, to convince Wilson that he would be safe in the Dominican Republic. Wilson flew to the Caribbean, but upon arrival was arrested and flown to New York. He was put on trial 4 separate times. Before he stood trial, several prosecution witnesses died under suspicious circumstances, including Cuban exile Rafael Villaverde, who was actually a veteran of the Bay of Pigs invasion, who disappeared in a boating accident near the Bahamas after an explosion on his boat, and former CIA agent Kevin P. Mulcahy, who had worked for Wilson and blown the whistle to the government. Wilson's friends, Ricardo Morales, a longtime nemesis of Villaverde in the Cuban exile community, would die in a bar fight in 1983. Wilson was found not guilty of trying to hire a group of Cuban exiles to kill Libyan dissident Umar Muhaishi. His co-defendant Frank Terpil never stood trial as he was a fugitive for the rest of his life and died in Cuba in 2006. He was found guilty of exporting guns, including one of them used in the Bonn assassination, and of shipping the explosives, and sentenced to 15 years in prison for the former and 70 years for the latter. While awaiting trial, he allegedly approached a fellow prisoner and attempted to hire him to kill federal prosecutors. That's that Willam Arico, who was the mafia hitman who worked for Michele Sidona, who had ties to the Banco Ambrosiano scandal with Roberto Calvi. So the prisoner instead went to the authorities, and they set Wilson up with an undercover agent. The agent taped Wilson. The agent taped Wilson hiring him to kill the prosecutor, 6 witnesses, and his ex-wife. In a subsequent trial, he was sentenced to an added 24 years in jail for conspiracy of murder. Jeez. Wow. So he died at 84 years old. Wow. and this is that book by Peter Moss, Manhunt: The Incredible Pursuit of a CIA Agent Turned Terrorist. Wow, this is wild, man. This is so crazy. All right. Well, so I think I'm just going to end it right there. So this was a really good article, and I'm just going to wrap it up here. But this connects to so many other things I talked about, the Blind Ghost Network. I mean, this is insane. Green Berets. So more to come. So more to come here. So thanks for your time, and I'm about to wrap this one up. All right, bye.